In this video, you will discover how to upregulate your dopamine receptors after porn addiction, or after any addiction, or just how to upregulate dopamine receptors in general. And we are going to take a look at 8 different action-based things you can do, as well as take a look at 8 different supplements that may potentially help to repair your dopamine receptors. Hi, it's Scandinavian Bob here, and so just a short disclaimer before we start.
This video is information only and not medical advice. If you need medical advice, please see your doctor. I'm not a doctor. I'm just a former porn addict who is going to share information here, and I assume no liability for the application of the information discussed in this video. In other words, always do your own research.
Alright, so we are going to be jumping between the actionable tips and the supplements here. So make sure to stay with me until the end of the video, as it will get more and more interesting as we go along. But let's start to the left here with the action steps, and these are the 3 absolute most important things if you're wondering how to upregulate your dopamine receptors. And the first one is of course going to be to stop consuming, or at least drastically reduce the very thing you are addicted to. So if you're a porn addict, then that's obviously going to be porn. If you're an alcoholic, it's going to be alcohol, and so on. That already is your main thing to focus on right here. If you remove the thing that blasted your dopamine system and you live an otherwise healthy life, your dopamine system will slowly but surely start to recover. But pay attention here now, because the next one on the list here is physical exercise. Now, most of you are probably not surprised to hear that, as we all know how good exercise is for us and the brain. But take a look at the following study they've done on this. They had a group of people who were using and were addicted to meth, which is an incredibly dangerous drug in so many ways, and for the dopamine system as well. And sure enough, these people had severely downregulated dopamine D2 receptors. In other words, they were really desensitized and numb. And then they divided those people into 2 different groups, and had one group quit the drug, take health education classes, and otherwise live a healthy life, but nothing else. And then they had the other group also quit the drug, live a healthy life, and on top of that also do pretty intense physical exercise 3 times a week. And after 8 weeks of doing this, when they took a look at the dopamine system of the group who only abstained from the drug, they saw a 3.13% increase in their dopamine receptors, while the group who abstained and also did physical exercise, well, they saw an increase of 13.89% in their dopamine receptor density. Now that is a big difference. And before you even go there, I need to point out, don't anyone twist my words here. Of course, I'm not comparing a porn addiction with something as destructive as meth addiction, but we do know that all addictions, no matter what you are addicted to, will hammer your dopamine system. And I'm showing this study just to drive home the point how extremely beneficial physical exercise is with helping with the repair of the dopamine receptors. I mean, you just saw the 8-week difference there, black on white in the meth study. And so if it can make that big of a difference there, then just imagine what it can do for quote-unquote milder addictions in life. Which brings me to the third important point to the left here. Quit or reduce the amount of other supernormal stimuli. Yes, if you have any other addictions besides porn, then in order to upregulate your dopamine receptors, you obviously need to stop engaging in them as well, or then at least drastically reduce the amount. And this is true even if you're not addicted. But let's say you have overcome your porn addiction, but you're still playing super stimulating video games for more than 6 hours a day, or maybe you're not addicted to alcohol, but you keep drinking recreationally many times a month to get that sweet dopamine buzz. Or maybe you eat super stimulating junk food several times a week. Well, then you should know that all those stimulating things add up and also take their toll on your dopamine system. Now, I'm not saying we can never indulge in any super stimulating things every now and then, because we certainly can, and we will recover just fine. But overuse of those supernormal stimuli will certainly hold you back, and if you go really hard with them, it may perhaps prevent recovery altogether. The good old word moderation is a word that comes to mind here, guys. And when I use the word moderation here, I'm obviously thinking of things that are fun and pleasurable, that you are not addicted to. Okay, so there are more actionable things we can do, but before we go to those, let's now take a look at a few supplements that may help to upregulate and repair your dopamine receptors. Alright, so before we start, I just want to say that I am not sponsored by any of these, obviously, since I won't even mention a brand, so I don't get 1 single cent from listing them here. I just use some of these myself, and I will tell you which ones in just a moment. So most of these I have been reading about before, but just a couple of days ago I also copied this list from a nootropics channel here on YouTube. However, what I myself have learned when reading about these, honestly, I have to say that, well, they really are not that impressive, except for the CDP choline here, which I myself already use, as it's the one that seems to have the most evidence behind it, and which ironically was not even included on this guy's list. And then I also sometimes take inositol, but already that one seems to have a bit weaker evidence behind it than choline. It could be that inositol is more helpful for upregulating receptors in general and not just dopamine D2 receptors, and then perhaps even more so serotonin receptors. And then I also take a good quality omega-3 supplement, more so for health and brain health in general, because here's the thing, we don't know if it also helps with upregulating dopamine receptors specifically, but there are plenty of studies showing how it helps with brain repair in general. And if that's the case, then it might be reasonable to think that it potentially helps with your dopamine system too. And since there are so many other health benefits of omega-3s, like cardiovascular benefits and general brain health, I take it perhaps more for that reason, with the hope that it's also good for increasing my receptors. So those are the ones I take myself, but I wanted to include the rest of them here as well, in case any one of you want to take a deeper dive, because honestly, I have not been diving that deep into the rabbit hole with everyone on this list. So of course I might have missed some interesting evidence. But again, I do have to say, yes, some of the rest here might potentially help a bit, but from what I've read so far, I'm not really that impressed. So in general, I have to say the action-based things to the left we are about to talk about are probably way more effective and cheaper and safer as well, of course. But I do have to say, I am interested in the last one here. I have not tried it yet, but according to some people, it has a homeostatic effect, which would mean that when taking it, it temporarily actually reduces your dopamine, and thus it's forcing your brain to create more receptors as a response. You know, kind of like suffer now and get the reward later. Now, personally, I have to say, I did not find very convincing evidence of this when it comes to this very compound. But I am, however, fully aware of that principle behind that phenomenon from a neurobiological standpoint, as it is the very opposite of an addiction, and also the very reason why things like dopamine fasting works, for example. I mean, as those of you remember from my presentation of how downregulation of the dopamine system happens, it happens because you present your brain's reward system with something super stimulating so that it releases so much dopamine, which are the small dots you can see on the screen right here, that your brain starts going, now there's too much dopamine here. I need to protect myself from it. And so it does so by reducing the number of dopamine D2 receptors that you can see on the screen right here, because it is those that dopamine are going to lock into. So if you bombard your brain with too much dopamine, it is the receptors to the right here that will be downregulated with time. Well, then likewise, the idea is that some compounds can temporarily reduce dopamine itself to the point that the brain starts going, oh, now there's actually too little dopamine here. I need to upregulate some of my receptors in order to compensate. And then that would be the idea behind how those compounds upregulate dopamine receptors. Now, we know for sure that there are some prescription drugs that are able to do this. But since we do not talk about medications on this channel, I have to say I'm a little bit skeptical of the claims with this very compound here. And also, I have to say I would be very careful of consuming something artificial to provoke this response, since there might be side effects we do not yet know about. And what if something goes wrong, so you get stuck in a state of too low dopamine production? I mean, that would be horrible. And besides, again, we can use this exact principle by, for example, doing different dopamine fasting protocols. Yes, because that's what you are doing when you do a dopamine fast. You drastically reduce dopamine releasing activities so that the brain will compensate by upregulating receptors. And unlike putting any chemicals in your body, this is a natural way of doing it. And it's a much safer and probably also a more effective way of depriving your brain of dopamine for a short while. I mean, there's nothing dangerous about reducing the amount of social media, junk food, and internet for a few days, just to name a few examples there. And with dopamine fasting, you are actually in control. I mean, at any point you can just add back the activity you removed, and you're not stuck with anything. Actually, guys, I seriously believe that dopamine fasting might just be the most effective thing you can do to help upregulate your dopamine receptors out of everything you are about to see on the whole animation board. Aside from removing the very core of your addiction, of course, which is obviously the number one thing you should be focusing on. And some of the world's most famous experts in this area, like for example the addiction expert Anna Lemke, as well as the neuroscientist Andrew Huberman, speaks very highly of dopamine fasting when it comes to upregulation of your dopamine receptors. But again, if you want to explore some of the supplements to the right here, by all means go right ahead and do so. But when it comes to stuff you consume, always remember to proceed with caution and always do your own research, okay? Cold showers are amazing because they help to increase both your dopamine levels as well as upregulate your dopamine receptors. Yes, so it's like a double whammy, but in a good way. And research suggests that regular meditation practice may lead to changes in the brain, including potentially increasing dopamine receptor density in certain areas. At least we know it helps with dopamine production, but the jury is still out on just how effective it is for upregulation of receptors. But if we apply the same logic here, in that it's basically the opposite of an addiction, then we understand that it could indeed be possible. I mean, just think about it. If you are meditating, you are temporarily depriving yourself of all stimulations, and you just sit there with your breath and your thoughts, and it's very boring. Well, again, that's kind of like the opposite of instant gratification activities, which, as we know, are the very activities that can downregulate your receptors. Intermittent fasting has also been shown to help dopamine receptor sensitivity and may potentially also upregulate the receptors. And the easiest way to do this, in my opinion, is to do the 16-8 window, or even better, the 18-6 window. Now, if you don't know what I mean by that, you can easily find info on that on Google. But here I also have to say that I have personally had some really interesting results a few times after having fasted from food for about 48 hours or so. Yes, at the end of those fasts, food tasted amazing, which is obviously to be expected. But not only that, music suddenly sounded better and my focus was sharper. And why would music suddenly sound better? That could very well be an indication that the dopamine receptors were indeed more sensitive, which is great. And perhaps the dopamine receptors also had upregulated a bit. Now, if you want to try fasting, again, please build up to it. Be careful and always do your research first. Sunshine has also been shown to be good for your brain, as well as upregulate your dopamine receptors. Now this one is kind of surprising, as many of the things that have been shown to work are things that take effort or a bit of pain in the moment, but then you get the reward afterwards, like physical exercise, cold showers, or fasting. But being outside in the sun and getting some sunshine on you is actually really joyful and pleasant in the moment as well. Yet it still helps, which is totally fine by me. I just find it very interesting, and it also shows that the dopamine system is complex and even a bit mysterious. Now, when it comes to dopamine fasting, I have received so many questions over the years about how to create a good and effective dopamine fasting protocol. So I actually went ahead and created a full online course about that, where I share 5 different super effective fasting protocols along with many other interesting dopamine hacks that you can try. And so you can read more about that course using the link under the video. And also take a look at the video you can see on the screen right here if you want to hear me talk about one of my 48-hour fasts I mentioned earlier.